Good morning, and welcome to today's Industry Week webinar, Securing Success, Embedding Cybersecurity in Your Digital Transformation, sponsored by GrayMatter. My name is Dennis Semeka, Senior Editor for Technology at Industry Week. Before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. If at any time you are having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. If you are running pop-up blocking software, you will need to disable it to view the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the question mark button in the upper right-hand corner to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon in the upper right corner to enlarge the window. We welcome your participation during today's event. To submit your questions, simply type into the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and then hit the Submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation. Please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we'll add them to the queue. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Industry Week website within the next day for you to review. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. When the webinar ends, please take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen. I'd now like to welcome today's speakers. Todd Virden, General Manager for Brilliant Operations and Advanced Analytics at GrayMatter, spent more than 13 years with General Electric in a variety of automation and integration roles. In his current role as the General Manager of Brilliant Operations and Advanced Analytics, he helps clients connect with dots and facilitate true digital transformation. Scott Christensen, Cyber Practice Director at GrayMatter, leads all facets of GrayMatter's cyber business with the focus on delivering cybersecurity solutions into OT and industrial environments. For more information about our speakers, check out the Speaker Details tab on your console. Welcome, gentlemen. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having us. So hi, everybody. Scott Christensen here, Cyber Practice Director from GrayMatter. I'm here with Todd, and we're going to kind of discuss really a one strategy approach to cybersecurity through your digital transformation. My background is just shy of 30 years in OT cybersecurity, even before we called it OT, back when we called it embedded systems, industrial control systems, or just general air quote SCADA. That's kind of my background. And we're going to kind of talk through how we can ingrain cybersecurity as part of enabling your advancement of your digital transformation. Todd?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Todd Virden, as Dennis said, General Manager of our Brilliant Operations practice here at GrayMatter. I spent about 15 years in industry, always on the shop floor, helping people collect and use data. So I come at most of what we do from a problem-solving standpoint. How do I get the data into the hands of the people that are trying to solve problems? And as Scott said, the more and more we interact with customers, the more we find that lots of people are on two separate journeys. One to collect and make data available, and one to protect data. And we really believe that coming at it together is the best way to get the data out to everybody safely and securely. So before we get into the meat of today's presentation, I want to go over a little bit of who GrayMatter is. So we are a 32-year-old technology company. We focus on consulting, implementation, and technology curation. So we've got about 270 to 300 folks on our team right now, scattered about North America. And we operate as both upfront consulting, helping customers like you all put together strategies, both short-term and long-term, to address current needs as well as things that we see on the horizon or that you see on the horizon. The vast majority of our team are implementation engineers, ranging from panel design, panel build, PLC, SCADA, MES, advanced analytics, and cybersecurity, so we can be an end-to-end service provider. And lastly, technology curation. So we pride ourselves on being on the forefront, always forward-looking and saying, what are the new current trends we see in the market, and how can those trends be leveraged by you to save more time, make more product, do more with what you've got. Next, I'd like to talk just a little bit about our GrayMatter family of brands. So you see the core logo here. Our motto is transforming operations and empowering people. We are overall GrayMatter, but you see on the right-hand side that we also have 4 other brand names that you may recognize. So eMerge, Automation and Control Concepts, HTSE, and Phantom Technical Services are all part of the GrayMatter family. So through the overall family, we've got capabilities to really help you from end to end. And lastly, before I turn things over to Scott for just a moment, the way we think about the work that we do is in what we refer to as our core four. So starting with automation and controls, that's everything from the panel design, panel build, panel implementation, and then all of the SCADA work that we do across a variety of platforms. Advanced industrial analytics. So for folks that have been on some sort of digital transformation journey for many years, we're helping them take that data and be more predictive or proactive with it. So rather than just having dashboards and reports of data, we're alerting of anomalies, saying this is not typical for what we see in this kind of process. Or, hey, the last time I saw these sort of conditions, you had a downtime event. So what can you do to remediate those conditions before you have that event rather than after? Or lastly, predictive quality. If we're monitoring the incoming ingredients of some process, we can recommend to the operator that they tweak the process before they make something out of specification. Brilliant operations sits kind of in the middle of those two. So it's taking the data coming out of the control systems and just making it more visible, whether it be Tableau, dashboards, or reports, or MES contextualization, bringing orders in from an ERP, tying it to the SCADA data to say what process was being run while those variables were what they were: pressure, temperature, humidity, what products was I making, who was I running it for, that sort of thing. And lastly, or most foundationally, Scott, I see you grinning there, cybersecurity. So what we say at GrayMatter is we don't really want to help you with any of the top three unless we are safely and securely moving your data around. The last thing that we want for any of our clients is to have great analytics and be the threat vector of a cyber attack the next week. That doesn't help us. It doesn't help you. So that's the core four. That's how we think about the work that we do, the way we're divided up. And with that, I will turn things over to Scott to introduce our one strategy approach.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of discuss how GrayMatter got into the cybersecurity business. So as we think about this, as we asked our customers to kind of go through a digital transformation, Industry 4.0, modernization, whatever kind of term you want to use for taking previous gen operational environments into next gen environments, we ran into the same kind of challenge over and over again. It was one of two things. One, we would go into an environment and the environment wasn't ready for it, right? The underlying infrastructure was not really designed around a security paradigm. And so there was a great introduction of risk to kind of go through these modernization efforts. Or secondarily, as we proposed, as Todd got into a room, talked about the great value of doing things like cloud strategy and analytics and all these kind of modernization efforts, there's inevitably a guy in the back of the room, his arms would be crossed, shaking his head no. And inevitably, this would be the one person who really focused on OT security, right? And he typically, his answer and the reason he would roadblock all the other wonderful things we do would be because his answer was, I care about security. You're about to introduce a whole bunch of risk into my environment. My job is to be risk adverse. So you're not going to do this without solving this challenge first, right? How do I do this? I'm going to introduce these modern technologies, these advancements in my environment without doing it in a way that's going to risk my production. Because I think it's the core function of what we do is, end of the day, we want to honor production, right? We want to minimize that downtime. We want to increase efficiencies. But if we introduce risk, such as cyber risk, we're actually inverting that, right? We're actually introducing potential downtime. So inevitably, that was really how we got into the cybersecurity business, was solving that problem as part of a larger digital transformation strategy. And that's what we came to call our one strategy, right? How do I combine these advancements with a risk mitigation strategy together? And that becomes pretty functional to what we do at our core for how we operate from GrayMatter's standpoint. Next slide. Yeah, and as we look at the big picture here, and I think this is always fun because Todd kind of teased me a little bit about foundationally cyber on the bottom, but really that's how we structure this. If you look at the three pillars of the core four, right? The automation controls, brilliant operations, analytics, those are seen as pillars, right? Those are modernization, those are digital transformation strategies. Those are all the things that we do in the operational world. But foundationally below them, we look at cybersecurity as how do I enable those things? And that becomes a key kind of component to what we talk about. a lot of times when we look at OT versus cybersecurity, that kind of adversarial conversation, it starts off with because the cybersecurity guys are the guys that tell me no. They're the guys that disable what I need to get done. And really, when you look at OT cybersecurity, the best programs start focusing on how do I enable people to do more, right? How do I enable them to do things like cloud strategy? How would I enable them to modernize or virtualize their infrastructure? All these other things we want to do, but do it in a way that doesn't create risk. And that becomes critical when we start attaching it to the early stages of a design or a digital transformation program, right? The earlier we do it in that design stage, the more cost effective it is, which, right, very critical in what we do. But secondarily, it allows it to be embedded in all the different pieces we do, that we really think through how will this impact our risk so that we're not trying year after we go live, trying to retroactively solve a problem we created. And I think that becomes pretty important when we look at it as a foundational structure. Todd?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. So what we've seen is that sometimes I'll come in and my group will help with a digital transformation, and we recommend that people have a cyber strategy in place. And sometimes there's those guys in the back of the room that like to be the office of no. And I actually like to start out most of my engagements or meetings saying, okay, who's in the room? I've got operational folks. Where are my IT friends? Because if they're brought in at the beginning of the conversation, they feel included and part of the solution. And if they're brought in late, even if it's just 2 or 3 meetings in, sometimes they feel like, oh, hey, you're trying to get around the cybersecurity or the IT, and they will clam up. So engage from the very beginning is the way I like to call it out.
100% agree.
Let me just throw all these up on the screen real quick.
So what are some of the things we're seeing, right? So when we start thinking about, we talked a little bit about the enablers versus disablers. And I think that's kind of critical, exactly what Todd's saying, because if you look at cybersecurity, I always call it the tinfoil hat wearers. We're the paranoid group, right? So our default answer is no, right? Because no is a state I understand, right? Deny all. It's a very basic concept in cyber, so it's easy for me to default to that. So when we look through it, how do I look through changing from that kind of enablement, that disablement mentality to an enablement mentality? So part of that would be an understanding of what is the goal we're trying to really focus on, right? What is the long-term strategy we're trying to accomplish here? Because a lot of times if we're engaged in that, we get a better understanding of the ways we can accomplish things. Because a lot of times we say no because we don't understand what the program is. So by understanding the program, I can say, oh, here's a better way to do that gets me more comfortable, allows me to be on board with this. And that second box, I think, probably is the most important aspect. And yes, it's a great little, rhyming scheme. If it's connected, you must protect it. I think when you think about that is very critical, because when you think about modernization efforts, taking devices that were serial IO and putting them on the network was something we started to do 15, 20 years ago. Well, a lot of times we didn't think through a security paradigm in this, right? We just connected it, get it up. If it's running, don't touch it, don't mess with it. Well, if you look at attackers, they love that mentality. Things that are big flat networks that are all focused on availability gives me a nice juicy attack subject to go after, right? Because I can get on anywhere. It's all connected. It's all working. It's all communicating to each other. So therefore, once I'm on, I own everything. And that becomes pretty important. And then the second, that last one, I think it's kind of important too, is when we talk about democratizing data. I think really when we talk about, there's 2 components, and I'll talk about my perspective of it, and then I'll let Todd talk about his perspective. But my perspective of it is, right, that a lot of the data we collect from a operational standpoint can be utilized from a security standpoint as well, right? What is my device levels? What are their patch levels? What are their version levels? What do they talk? What are their behaviors in the network? Those can be utilized both from a security perspective, but it also can be used from an operations perspective. So a lot of times operationalizing that data becomes critical here. Todd?
Yeah, so I definitely think about that one a little bit differently. And I think about the air-gapped control systems, right? Where, hey, I've had a SCADA for 20 years. It runs my process. But if I want to look at the historian trend data, I have to actually go out to the control room and look at that data. That is not the most efficient, especially in a world today where lots of folks are at-home workers. So I'm constantly in the realm of how do I get data out of the control system into an environment where people have access to it whenever, wherever they need it. I like Scott's analogy. He says, from a cyber perspective, their ideal state would be take the server, encase it in concrete, and drop it to the bottom of the ocean, right? Super low threat vectors there. But if we do all that, I can't give anybody the data to do anything with. So when we combine forces and we talk about what are the use cases, who needs to have the data, when do they need to have it, we can start to think about getting the data where it needs to go, whether it be Azure or AWS in a cloud environment to do Tableau or Click or Power BI reporting, or it'd be MES kind of capabilities. I don't really care, but I need to get it to that endpoint safely and securely. So we start talking about how am I authenticating? How am I doing my multi-factor? How am I encrypting the data end to end? How can I cloak the things on site? So there's lots of things we can do up front to make it all easier. But if we just say, hey, you know what? Open up that firewall port, get the data up to AWS. We're going to hit it with Tableau tomorrow morning. Then when we start to put measures in place to protect it, the users are going to have a different experience. And I like to think a lot about how do we impact the end users? Because ultimately, data in any system is useless unless somebody can act on it. So safely, securely, get the data where it needs to go, and let it be where people can use it.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to come up on our first survey question, right?
Yeah, we are. So I'm going to send this to the audience right now. Question: Are your cybersecurity and digital transformation strategies aligned? So here in a couple seconds, it'll start to pop up on your screen.
Yeah, and while you guys are responding that, you're thinking through your answers, I kind of want to jump into with how Todd and I first met. Kind of my favorite story in this, because it really kind of speaks volumes to a disconnected strategy. One of the things we think about, right? So how Todd and I met was kind of interesting. I was brought on board, and he was running a plant that was going through a modernization effort, a brilliant transformation. And I was brought on board to said, hey, Scott, we need you to talk to this plant lead. He's being a little bit difficult. We've got a lot of security technology we want to deploy to his environment, and he's kind of roadblocking it. So it's like, okay, great. Let me jump on board. Let me have a conversation. So Todd and I had our first kind of conference call with a bunch of other people, and about 15 minutes in the conversation, I realized a couple things had occurred. One was Todd was really trying to explain his challenges or what he was trying to accomplish, and we weren't aligned really with the goals that Todd was trying to do. But secondarily, a lot of the tools that we had provided or tools that were sold to Todd weren't applicable to his environment. He couldn't even consume the data, consume the technology that we had put in place. While it was great technology, because of his environment itself, his infrastructure did not support the mechanisms that we were putting in place. So a lot of that came to just a disconnect because they had waited till implementation to have this kind of security and underlying infrastructure conversation, rather than back in the design stage and saying, hey, what does your network look like? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the things we should be aware of? And if we had just had that 15-minute conversation early in the cycle, Todd wouldn't have had a closet full of boxes of equipment he couldn't use. And it was really how Todd and I first met 10 years ago. So to me, that really speaks volumes to this approach where you align both your cybersecurity and your digital transformation strategies together. Because if you don't, you're really going to run into those kind of hurdles that to this day, 10 years later, those boxes are still sitting in that plant, still sitting in a closet, because no one really thought through aligning those two conversations. And so that's one of the things we really want to avoid. And Todd and I talked about this yesterday with a customer. The things we hate more than anything else are shelfware. Things that are bought because, hey, this will be the greatest technology ever. But when it comes into being evaluated or really implemented, we say, oh, we can't use this. Our network's not ready for this, or we can't use this. Our environment doesn't support this. So one of the things you want to really truly avoid is that kind of shelfware mentality, right? Things that look great on paper, look great in a demo, but don't really apply when it comes to fixing the operational issues. Todd, I don't know if you want to share some of that.
I think you hit the story spot on. We had implemented the IT architecture that was set forth, right? We weren't operating in a silo, but there was not a cyber strategy. There was an IT strategy. We had servers, we had firewalls, we had VLANs. But then when we said, hey, let's add cyber monitoring on top, we could have implemented the stuff we had, but it wouldn't have worked as intended because we had a very flat network. And at the time, and this was quite a few years ago, but that technology needed segmentation by protocol to really understand how is the traffic acting. And when you just have everything on a flat network, that didn't work. So fast forward, there's different technologies, there's just different ways of approaching it. But I think the story still holds true that if you're doing a digital transformation and you're talking about getting data, thinking through these aspects up front is really where the major benefits come in. So I did send the results back. Looks like quite a few people have not voted. So if you have a few seconds, please vote. But I'm happy to see that more than 50% do have strategies that are aligned. So that's encouraging.
That is a very encouraging sign, because that is probably the first and biggest hurdle we typically see, is just that conversation doesn't happen early. And so it's great to see kind of over 50%, almost 60% of respondents. You guys doing a good job. That's critical. I think that's great.
So gonna flip things around a little bit, but still very pertinent to the conversation, and the move to the cloud. So one of the things that I see a lot on the digital transformation side is folks looking to move to cloud resources for a variety of reasons. Number one is it's less resources on their team. In a time when it is hard to find skilled people in things like server management, database deployment, networking, et cetera, if I can shift some of that over to Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, whatever, I can lower my internal headcount needs at least some. Another good example is I can share instances across the organization. So where things may have previously all been on-prem, I've got an ESX cluster and the MDF up in the front of the room. I'm spending $100,000 on it. It's outdated a year and a half after I put it in, and I'm paying support on it. Well, now with having the cloud, I can have this set of shared resources. I can pull my data into one instance, so I can maybe have, say, 10 sites running in the same environment. Well, now it's a lot easier to compare data. Another benefit, oh, hey, somebody else is keeping those things updated and patched and whatever on my behalf. It seems like a win-win-win. And there we go. Hardware is handled by them as well. I'm not worried about material obsolescence anymore. I'm not worried about, I just spent $100,000 of CapEx. It's outdated 4 years in, but my GAAP rules say I have to depreciate it for 8 more years before I can go buy a new one. Those are tough conversations between finance and IT. When we shift to cloud, we're also shifting from a CapEx to an OpEx model. So it just changes the spending altogether. And lastly, scalability. So I don't have to think as much about, well, how much RAM and CPU do I need on this box? What apps might I use 2 years from now? So let me make sure I size this cluster just perfectly. Oh, shoot, I want to run 3 more things on it that I never thought of. Or, hey, everybody runs their reports when they first get into the office in the morning. So at 7 a.m., my CPU load and my RAM is completely maxed out for the first hour and a half. In the cloud, that all goes away, right? I can have an elastic environment that just scales with my users, with the day, and as I need to add more, it's all great.
Yeah.
However, go ahead, Scott.
I was going to add in the security side of this too, right? So I'll add in the kind of the oh, here we go, perfect. Yeah, so this you're already ahead of me. So as we look at it, right? So what are the challenges? So I'll say this: the first, you gain a lot of resiliency and redundancy by moving to the cloud. No doubt, you're not going to beat the investment that Microsoft, Amazon, Google have in their data centers from a resiliency and redundancy standpoint. It's just not possible from an investment standpoint to match that. Now, where does your risk lie then, right? Since I have so much more resiliency, is it secure? Well, the problem then becomes my data in transit, right? Getting from A to B when it's on-prem is much easier to lock down and control than it is if I have to go up to the cloud as A to B. So really thinking through, how do I protect it? Putting tunnelized technologies in place can be critical here. We're really big fans of using tools like software-defined networking and encrypted tunneling, really making sure to protect all the data as it flows in and out of the facility. But then the other aspect of it is understanding what needs to be in the cloud, what doesn't need to be in the cloud, taking value in that. And then when we start thinking about the trust, right? We think Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all these, they've got this, a certain level of trust we have with it, but we still want to verify what they've got, right? What certifications are they running? What tools do they have in place? what things can I do to enable and protect the risk in my environment? And then lastly, right, when we talk about OT environments, there's always the cost kind of conversation, right? If I have a very heavy CapEx model, it's going to be very difficult from a cloud enablement strategy standpoint. But there's a value to be able to move to that OpEx, right? We all kind of understand the outlay of cost over time. It makes more sense in some ways. So a lot of times that conversation is understanding, is it the value over time cost or the value of the initial outlay? So really understanding where that is becomes a big inflection point from a decision standpoint when thinking of a move to cloud strategy. Todd?
Yeah, so we've got another survey coming up here in a little bit. Want to get your feedback on this, but as I think what I'd say is, as you're thinking about, stand by. Why is this not working? There we go. As you're thinking about your cloud strategies, maybe also think about what are the reasons that are driving you to move to the cloud, and what problems are you trying to solve with that, or is it just a technology play? How are your end users going to interact with the software? What benefits do you really get from moving there? And is the juice worth the squeeze, so to say? Is the risk of moving your data to a public cloud worth the benefits that you think you're going to get out of it, right? Because now, on the flip side of that, I'll also say that I don't think there's probably anybody in the world better at real-time patching than the three big players we just mentioned, because they have teams dedicated to managing that environment on your behalf. And chances are you have pretty good SLAs with them and disaster recovery and whatnot. So if you currently manage on-prem solutions, you probably have a team that is constantly fighting with the OT team to say, can I patch, can I update? And they're saying, no, I'm running production, no, I'm running production, no, I'm running production. So then the question and the conversation starts to shift to, what applications can move to the cloud and can have automatic patching where I don't have to be a month behind or a year behind in testing of those applications to make sure that latest patch isn't going to bring the system down.
Yeah, 100% agree on that. The components become critical. In fact, Todd and I kind of had our jaw drops at a recent conversation. We were at a conference, and an oil and gas vendor mentioned that he was moving everything to the cloud, network assets, SCADA resources, everything to the cloud, that he was going to own no physical hardware anymore. Not sure of everybody being able to go that path, and not sure I recommend that for everybody, but it was interesting to see that some people are moving or even considering that as an option. Because if I had told Todd that, 2 years ago, hey, I got customers who are moving everything into the cloud, the SCADA included, Todd would still be laughing at me today. So a lot of times that's the discussion, is what components make sense in the cloud, and can I put a mitigation strategy around that? And what make no sense to ever be in the cloud, and make sure that I understand how do I protect those assets as well. Because a lot of times when we think about it, the cloud, it's the avenue up is what we focus on, right? The cloud itself, sending data up, but it's also the data down, right? Understanding what risk am I associated as I connect down in my assets. Because as you create that connectivity, that data in transit, you also have to think through what holes am I opening up into my production network to get the data from A to B. And so that's some of the things you want to think through. Is there value to having those things there? And as well as understanding what my network infrastructure, kind of go with the poll question, right? Is your network infrastructure ready for this? So a lot of times what you want to think through is that capable? Do I have the right mitigation strategies in place? Do I have the right tools in place? Do I have the right firewall policy? Todd's heard this story probably a dozen times, at least in the last couple of weeks. But one of the things we do when we evaluate firewalls, when we do an audit, is we look for things like any rules. And we've had a manufacturer, and it's our current record holder, who had 17 any's on a firewall. No one had thought through that, hey, opening up all these ports and forgetting about them, what was our impact or risk? So those are the kind of things you want to really evaluate, because as you build up your connectivity, as you build up your policies against this, you really want to reevaluate, are there conflicting rules? Do we have things that are outdated that are creating risk in our environment? Have I poked holes or created backdoors into my production network? Or do I have a really strong architecture in place that protects the data flows as they come and go out of the network?
Yeah, and the last piece I'll say on this before we move on to the next poll question is, and it ties out to the poll question, but is your infrastructure ready to support it? I usually won't even start the conversation on does cloud make sense until I ask the question of what do your pipes look like? Do you have dual circuits? Do you have dual ISPs? How often do you go down today with your connection to the outside of the building connection? Got a customer recently that said, hey, we're out in the middle of nowhere. It's not uncommon for backhoes and trackhoes to dig up our lines. If those are the case, we might not want to think about cloud first or cloud only, but more of a hybrid cloud, right? What components really should be on-prem, and then at what frequency do we move the data to the cloud? If you're we're sitting in St. Louis today, if you're in the middle of a city center and you're not worried about network resiliency because you never have outages, that's a different story. But thinking through those components as you're thinking about your strategy is also super important. So with that, we're going to send this one out to the audience. And we'll wait a few seconds to let things align.
Yeah, and I'll give a good example of that too. Customers we've dealt with in the past, sometimes we'll have a manufacturing plant in a less than ideal rural location from an infrastructure standpoint, and maybe have ran their own fiber over time. And we find out that fiber, by the way, after 20 years has a pretty high failure rate. The glass starts breaking, you get crushed lines, et cetera. And one of the customers we've worked with in the past, one of their struggles was as they went through modernization, they were blaming the upgrades to the applications as the problem for their network failure. But when we tested the fiber, which was 25 years old, we found out that they had 2 strands lit out of 24. So 22 broken strands and only 2 strands may be causing some of your packet loss, a lot of your data connectivity loss issues. So when you think through infrastructure, the network is piece of it. But the other thing I also want you to think through is, what does my server infrastructure look like? Do I have virtualization in place? Do I want to invest in modernizing that hardware? Or is some of that can be offloaded to the cloud? So that becomes part of the conversation in this kind of design category that becomes pretty critical. So let's see, it looks like pretty even split. About half the people believe that their networks are ready to support modernization, and about half the people going back and forth, half the people think no. And I think it's a fair when we talk about a lot of times how do we begin a program, you'll hear use the term assessments, and both Todd and I use the term assessments, but we look at through different lenses. I would encourage you to kind of have a joint assessment done, right? What does my manufacturing assessment look like, right? My SCADA infrastructure, all that. But also, what does my risk assessment look like? What does my network assessment look like? So that you have a complete picture. Because I think a lot of times we make decisions without data. And I think what's really valuable about an assessment is it gives you the data so that you're not making decisions based on assumptions. So I think it's pretty interesting. And by the way, we just hit 50-50 dead on. So I think it's pretty telling. And that's pretty much what we see reflective of the kind of the environments we go into. It's about half the time, yes, we've got a pretty good network. We've invested and we did a current refresh of our switches, firewalls, et cetera. And then about half the time, no, we've not touched anything in 20 years. And most of our gear is unmanaged switches, or I've got end-of-life firewalls, right? That pretty common, right? So those are the things we want to think through when we try to discuss the holistic picture of a modernization project.
Yeah, I like to buy my unmanaged switches from Amazon, get them as quick as possible, and just get the data flowing. And then,
yeah, exactly. If they're made in China, that's okay. But that's really the things we want to think through, right? Because as you go to invest in here, you got to understand the complete picture of what you're investing in. Because a lot of times, I'll say Todd's team gets blamed for performance issues. Say, hey, you guys stood up this infrastructure, you stood up these applications, and now my network crashes every day at 3:00. And then we find out that a lot of times it's because as they went through the modernization and the workload increased part because we're asking the systems to do more, the network can't support that. So those are the things we want to really evaluate. So it's a little bit of a cyber, but it's also more of an infrastructure conversation as well.
So again, keeping with the theme, we ask a poll question, we switch topics. The next conversation is really about, are you using tools that are more tailored for your specific use case, your business case, or using out of the box? And what I see on the digital transformation side is over the years, many people have built very custom applications, oftentimes in Excel, or using VB6 to solve the very specific need that they needed to cover. With that comes some difficulties, to be quite honest. So I'm always of the camp, as much out of the box functionality as you can get from your software vendors, the easier time we will have with things like end of life hardware, end of life operating systems, that sort of thing. So when Scott and I are doing the co-assessment approach, I always ask the question of, are we looking at your hardware also as a part of this, or are we looking at your overall cyber strategy? Because if I'm just moving an application from some old thing that you built to some modern thing, chances are I probably need the latest version of SQL Server or the latest version of Windows to run that new thing. And then we ask the question, well, what version are you on today? And what does that look like? And a lot of times customers are saying, well, I'm running version whatever, 3 dot something, and I can't move because of XYZ functionality. And then Scott comes in, he's like, but, and so I'll let you go into some of the things you see on the threat vector side from being on those older versions.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things we don't take into account is we think of the tailored tools as customized and they fit my needs. And sometimes there's even a cost savings associated with it. It was cheaper to build my own than it was to buy something and tailor it to me, right? But the challenge you got there is when you think about the life cycle of technology and OT, that works great if I'm planning on replacing applications every 5 years. I'm going to update my operating systems every 5 years. But what happens when in 15 years, that custom app that only runs on Windows 7, now I have to update my Windows 7 and I have to go back to that custom software writer, or I have to find the guy that retired 5 years ago after he built it, and I have to now get him to modernize it onto an OS that is supported. It doesn't have vulnerability and risk in my network. And he comes back, or the company comes back and says, hey, great, give me 7 figures. I'll update that so that it'll run on Windows 10. That is probably one of the most common things we run into when it comes to kind of updating, because we'll make a recommendation. Hey, get rid of all your unsupported operating systems. And inevitably, we'll find a custom app that only runs on this particular OS. The company that supports it's either a small company or went out of business or was only done as a one-off. And so the answer comes back to, yeah, of course we can get this onto Windows 10. That'd be $1.5 million just to modernize the application before you buy everything else. Or some version of that is probably one of the more common things we run into when you think about those custom applications. You think, oh, great, it's tailored to me. But that also means from a support standpoint, it's not beneficial cost structure wise to support just one customer unless I charge them astronomically to support it. So when you think through, when you go forward and I say, hey, I've got to update my operating system, will this application work on Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows 20 in the future, whatever it might be? And I have to go do that upgrade. And I have to think back, oh, I have this such a tailored application. It's not been maintained. It's been left alone. It worked. But now I have to update it. And now I have to talk about the vulnerabilities associated with it. Then I have a whole different risk. And then the other side of this is when you talk about building an application, what was used to build the framework of the application? Did it have inherent vulnerabilities? So a perfect example of that is about 2 years ago, everybody ran into the Log4j vulnerability because every device out there used a JavaScript to do back-end logging of servers. Pretty basic. It was open source, very easy to use. All these software code and developers utilized it. And then overnight, we found out that 20 billion devices could be remote executed. I could take a payload and deliver it onto it if it was using this Java logging script on the back end. So now I had 20 billion devices that I have to figure out how to patch because they used an open source JavaScript to do their logging. So that's a more common than we want to talk about application versus an out-of-the-box solution that's supported by a large organization that has updates regularly, has patches even if I don't apply them. At least now I have an upgrade path built into supporting that product. From a security perspective, that becomes pretty critical. And I think that's the other. And then we can always talk about DLLs and secure development lifecycle and all the risk associated with not following these kind of best practices. But really, when you start thinking about it, there's a future cost that you should be expecting if you kind of go so tailored and so customized that you got to think through, how's that going to impact me when I have to replace the system in 10 years?
Yeah, heaven forbid the lone person that actually remembers that code base is even still around and in the workforce.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how often we run into something where it's like, oh yeah, Bob retired 5 years ago and nobody really took it over from Bob, and it still runs. So don't touch that thing. And there's risk mitigation strategies there too, but at some point we really need to talk about a replacement strategy because that software is just going to not run eventually for hardware or software or OS or some kind of issue.
Yeah, I always talk this story of walking the plant floor, and it was at a very large power gen site in Asia. Walking the plant floor and get into the control room, and there was a server sitting, keyboard and mouse disconnected, but sitting on top of it in the corner of the room, and a sticky note that says, "Do not power off." So, being the assessor, being the auditor, my first question is, okay, what's on that? Can we log in? What is that? Oh, we don't touch that. What do you mean? And it's the Bob. It was literally where I called find the Bob. As well, Bob stood that up. It runs on NT. It works, but no one has a clue how it works. So our fix was, let's unplug the keyboard and mouse so that no one can make changes as long as it's working. Like, okay, interesting. And what does it run? Oh, that's our safety system. So when you think through that, those are the things you want to avoid, right? When you get so custom, you got one guy who has everything in his head, you have a very much a bigger risk. And we always talk about the bus factor, right? If a bus hits someone, how many buses would it take to stop production, stop your advancement of your modernization? If it's one, that's a scary number, right? Because that guy retires, he just gets fed up, he gets hit by a bus, God forbid he gets COVID. After I coughed, right? So, I mean, but those are, these are all things that could impact us. And all of a sudden, all my knowledge, all my kind of advancement is stuck in someone's head that may not be available to me.
All right, so we're going to send another poll question out. This one's similar to one we asked already, but we asked earlier, are your strategies aligned? This one is more on the people side. Do you have a counterpart in if you're an OT person, if you're a controls person, do you have a cybersecurity person, and how are you engaged in working together? We'll give this a few seconds. Nice. The yeses are jumping out to the win, which is great.
My favorite answer for that. A few years back, and I use this as an anecdote, I noticed a trend in oil and gas. Being from Houston, it's kind of the OT industry I spend a lot of time with. And one of the things I started noticing, they started creating joint functional teams for digital transformation. They may call them process control domain. They may call them process control network. They've got a bunch of different functional names. But really where I thought these were pretty successful was they took operations people, they took IT people, put them in the same group, and allowed them to collaborate. Because what we ended up seeing is, one, a lot of the things that the security guys would push down, they never realized why those didn't work in OT. I'll pick on patching policy, right? Go patch Tuesday. Everyone, every first Tuesday of the month, you got to push those patches out, right? Why isn't OT doing that? Well, because no one ever collaborated with the IT guys. That's not practical. I can't validate the patch. I don't know if it's going to break my systems. It may not even work with the applications I've got in play. So obviously I can't patch, but no one really had that conversation. When we started seeing these cross-functional teams, those things started dripping off, right? They stopped being where security would mandate something impractical. You see less of that. And then the inverse would also be the operations started getting awareness of, oh, now I understand why we have to do it this way, why we have to use secure login. I can't just use a team viewer or some other remote access tool. I have to start thinking through how it is. I get why the security guy cares about this. So a lot of times it gets an understanding that develops. And what ends up happening a lot of times, I think is probably the best byproduct of it, is it accelerates the program because people start understanding what the other guy's asking. So you don't have to have so many collaboration meetings to get everyone on the same page, because cross-functionally they're already working together. And I think it's kind of critical. And I love the fact that we're getting almost 70% of people saying yes, that you guys have a counterpart that you work with. I couldn't imagine a better answer. That's a great ratio.
Yeah, and once you know who that person is and you're aligned, I like to say you can start working with them differently and for the better. So if I do need a firewall rule changed or implemented, I know who to ask and how to ask it in a way that I'm telling them why I think I need it. But we can have that risk mitigation conversation early in that request. So we don't go, again, back to most folks don't want to be the office of no, but they become the office of no because they don't understand the why. So when I'm asking for a rule to be implemented, if it comes with the why, the answer might still be no, but it'll probably be a no but. And I love the no but responses, because that tells me that they heard my request, they get it, and they are thinking about a risk adverse way of solving that problem.
Yeah, give me an alternative, right? Don't just tell me no. Tell me what's the alternative, right? Here's a better way to do this. We joked last night that we've seen engineers say that's a dumb way to do things, right? That we've seen engineers respond that. And I hate that. Even if it is a dumb way to do things, it's a horrible response because it doesn't really give you feedback. It doesn't give you corrective actions to make. So for me, it's always a much better way to say, hey, how about we try this way instead? It'll accomplish what you want, but do it in a way that I can sleep at night. And I think that becomes kind of the critical conversation, right? Is, hey, no, but here's a better way to do it. And I think it's very much important when we start talking about this.
So we're going to spend just a couple minutes going through a couple recent case studies. And Scott, I'll let you lead on any one of these. I don't know that we'll hit all three as we make sure we want to save some time for the Q&A here at the end. But I think we'll go through one or two of these, and then we'll jump into the, how do you start your strategy and your approach?
I'm going to start with the last one, of course, because I like to be difficult. But this is an interesting one because building materials, right, is a low margin. You typically have legacy equipment is very prevalent. Things that have been out of support for a decade or more, pretty common. A lot of times network infrastructure neglect is a nice word to use in this space. Neglected is common. And so when we start thinking about this, as they were going through and they were thinking through their bigger picture, right? They wanted to do some stuff and all the fancy stuff that Todd sells, right? They love all the stuff that Todd does. But then as they evaluated their network infrastructure, they could not support any of it. I think we found half their firewalls were out of support and end of life. We found that they had a number of managed switches. They had bad network connectivity. They had very little virtual infrastructure in place. So the lift from Todd's side to even try to accomplish something impossible would be the nice way to put it. I think
monumental to impossible.
There we go. Yeah. So we started to evaluate it from how do we get the underlying work done first to enable the stuff that they want to really do. And what we ended up finding out is we attached the teams together, that it accelerated the program for these guys. So it went from one or two sites to, I forgot how many sites total now, but it's quite a few. And it was quick to understand that all of a sudden they started getting operational efficiencies by fixing some of their network issues. I think that was some of the things that we were noticing, that they were one of the ones that, hey, you guys deployed some of this and now my network goes down every day at 3:00. Why is that? It's all your fault. No, what we found out that there was some infrastructure challenges, that there was some bad routing, there was some bad architecture. But by improving that, then Todd was able to get more data out than he'd ever been before, and they could start advancing kind of the digital transformation program. So really by attaching those together, it became a very, very slick operational efficiency together. I thought that was pretty a unique way to approach it from what I would say is an industry that typically doesn't approach it that way.
Yep, that's a really good example of getting the foundation in place earlier has now enabled us to go faster with getting that data moved up to a centralized environment for doing more with it, for integration into ERP and data presentation for decision making outside of the control room operator kind of view stations. Yeah,
and then the complete opposite of that is the green energy startup, right? Starting from nothing, but we had a criteria to move quick. And I think that's kind of, when you look at it, that could be a challenge because, moving quick, mistakes can be made. But, we talk about being agile, and that was really the focus here. But being agile in both our network design became critical to enabling Todd to be agile in his delivery of everything. So I think that was a unique one. Todd, I don't know if you want to kind of color commentate that one, but I think that one's probably my favorite because it was unique challenges in that we had a very fast timeline, and monumental is a different type of monumental here, is how quickly we had to deliver on something or this company wasn't going to be producing.
Yeah, absolutely. So great example. They do different things all over the country, lots of different sites, moving towards, hey, I've got local control from the SCADA system, but I've got cloud-based monitoring centrally, and I need to be able to, again, safely and securely move that data around. But sometimes I'm connected via cellular out to the World Wide Web. So how do I get that data moving when my cell signal's not very good? I only have one cell provider in certain areas. So helping them assess store and forward capabilities as well as encryption, but getting that data pushed out in real time. So super interesting. Again, started the conversation with SCADA, but very quickly identified that there were strong cyber and networking needs into the project. Allows us to put together a project team that's cross-functional, right? It's not just SCADA people, it's not just cyber people, not just networking. It's bringing the power of all together and saying, how do I solve this problem overall? So I'm going to jump ahead a couple slides real quick and just talk about strategy. So this one, just super quick, we've got what we refer to as our solution wheels on both sides, and really, we think about it as how do you combine them into one, and how to get started. And for us, getting started starts with, I'll say, a list of questions. And we've got very different questions on here on purpose. My list on the right side, I mentioned this at the beginning, but it's all about pain points. What problems are we trying to solve? What things are you doing today, right? What Excel files are you filling out today? What PowerPoint templates are you filling out for monthly or quarterly reviews? How do we affect the status quo? How do we take the data that you are using, collecting, managing, and make an impact? And then who cares, right? Who are the key stakeholders that need to be aligned to this overall digital transformation to make sure that the things we're talking about affect as many people as possible, not negatively, but in a positive way? And then, oh, hey, by the way, we flip it around and say, Scott, what things do you care about up front?
And interestingly enough, it's similar in a different way. Pain points. What are we trying to solve from a pain? That is always going to be the way we focus on. What is the challenge we're solving, right? Is it enabling digital transformation? Is it reducing risk? Is it preventing unplanned downtime? Whatever it might be. But let's understand that in a little bit more granular detail and how that impacts us. Then work backwards to what our options are. Because I think the interesting part about how we approach these things is there's never a one product solves all problems. There's no magic bullet when it comes to approaching this. So a lot of times when we're talking about this is, what are we trying to solve? What data do we have? Network diagram is always a perfect one, right? Do we have an asset inventory? Do we have a network diagram? Do we understand what data comes and goes out of the network? Do we understand what our critical assets are, our critical processes are? Because those are going to be the things we want to put the protections around, right? Those are the keys to the kingdom. Those are the most important things we want to look at. And what are the challenges around each of those? So once we understand that, then we can start looking through what are our options. Because every option kind of has a good and bad side to it, right? If we approach it this way, this is why we would do it this way. But here's what we give up by doing it that way. Those are the kind of conversations you want to start to have to decide where you want to accept the risk and where the risk is unacceptable. And then you put a program around that mirrors to what Todd and his strategy are focusing on.
So okay. Where do we get started? I think we both would say, let's start small, right? Identify what Scott just said. What are the key processes that you need to protect? Because those are probably also the ones you need to get data from. Pick a proof of concept. I've done a whole separate session on proof of concepts, proof of value. How do you get into a pilot and out of a pilot? But I think about a proof of concept of, will this work? Does this provide any kind of meaningful thing? Not even value. I don't want to say the word value, but is there anything meaningful coming out of this? And should I, to quote the lean startup, pivot or persevere? Right? Do I keep going? And then go after the value, right? Because if it doesn't work, you can pivot. But if you go after value too quick, I find that we get stuck in the pilot purgatory, as I like to call it, because we are searching for that value. And I like to say, just, is there anything meaningful coming out of this? And we do that oftentimes through the assessments, right? So assessments can be upfront before the starting small, or it can be after you've started and kind of know what you're going after. You can tailor that assessment. Scott does a lot of assessments to NIST standards. On the digital transformation side, there's all kinds of non-governing bodies that believe that they've got a standard that assessment should be done to. But I like to say, let's tailor it a little bit to your organization and what you're trying to get out of it. Cyber side, okay, there's a NIST framework, got it. There's a governing body. They suggest the way we should audit. Digital transformation is a little different, but I think we're always going after the same thing. how do you future-proof your supply chain, your resiliency to add value overall?
And I think it's critical when you think about a standard, it's you just want an objective criteria for success. I think that's when we look at standards, that's the most important. What are we measuring ourselves against? And is it objective, right? From my standpoint, the reason we use tools like NIST and IEC 62443 and all the other ones out there is it just gives us a commonality in language, and it gives us an objective standard to measure. Are we measuring up to best practices in X? Does this give us a criteria of success? Because at the end of the day, it's not about perfection. That's really not the goal of what we're trying to do. But what we're trying to say is, are we meeting a baseline standard, and where are our opportunities for improvement? I wouldn't even call them weaknesses. I'll call them opportunities for improvement, because it really matches to what Todd's trying to do, right? Where are the areas that we can focus on to improve? And it goes for security or it goes for operations. And then what are the key components to building that out? And how do I focus on being able to do that?
So with that, we're going to turn things back over to Dennis. I think we've got a few questions in the chat. So Dennis, what do you have for Stump the Professors today?
We do indeed have some questions, Todd. First one, what security controls, measures, framework do you use to govern customers' production data in another environment, like development or Q&A, for utilization?
So I think for me, I look at it from a perspective of what can I consume and what is realistically capable of, right? So easy one I can always say is you go like NIST 882. It's an industrial control system standard. I can measure it across anything that's a controls environment. But is that really applicable if I'm talking a lab environment or a dev environment or something outside of my actual production? Maybe yes, maybe no. Really depends on how we want to apply it. It also depends on the interactivity between your environment and that production, that lab environment, et cetera. One of the places we like to look at is we typically like to start with a lighter framework that gives me a baseline to measure against to see a maturity model build up. So for NIST, that would be the CSF, starting with a much lighter, looking at the 5 function categories, understanding how those apply in my environment, and then looking for where I can build my maturity into it. Because that's the most important thing when we look at it. The challenge a lot of people look at, and I think a lot of people focus on, is they look at security as a destination, right? I'm going to be at this point, I plant a flag, I'm secure, great, let's move on. That's never going to occur. There's no point at which you're going to say, hey, I'm 100% secured, never have to worry about it again. It's a journey. So what you want to really look for is, how am I measuring against maturity? So how am I developing? So for example, if I denote that we don't have good backup processes, my first step is let's develop a documentation around backup processes. Then I want to implement them and I want to test them. And each of those are reiterative in improving my maturity against that one functionality. And the other part about it is look at it from a uniformity standpoint. What applies most uniform across my different infrastructure? So while we like NIST, if I'm US based and I'm North America based, this is very well received here. It may not be as applicable in Asia or in South America or non-US entities. So understanding how that might apply and looking for maybe there's a more universal standard and really applying those. And it really depends on vertical and a bunch of other things as well. But really trying to look at from a baseline, what is the initial I want to apply it to? And then how do I show that maturity as I grow into that?
The only other thing that comes to my mind on this question before we move on to the next one is on the access control. So typically, a larger set of users need access to the production environment. I will typically say lock down dev and QA to the very few people that actually need it, and do that through good multi-factor based authentication approaches, so that it's like, hey, the whole organization doesn't need that. So on top of everything else that Scott's talked about, make sure only the right people have access to those systems.
Yeah, need to know is important in the dev environment. And I also would say adding in change and version control is critical there as much as anywhere else as well. Making sure the people who have access are the right people, and making sure the people who are allowed to apply changes are the people who should be applying those changes. Getting an approval process in there. It's the same way you would do any good code development. You still want to apply it to a production test environment, same way. Great question.
Dennis, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, we have time for one more. Can you speak to security-related SBOM on the OT/IoT side?
Always a tricky one, right? When we're talking security, the build of materials around applications in there, I look towards rather than product specific, it comes back to what are we solving, right? If I'm in an OT environment, I want to look at the techniques that the tools use and can I apply them in my environment? And I'll give you a great example of that. In OT, we typically don't want to look for hard scanning utilities. If I have a tool that does hard scanning of my network or my appliances, that application may cause me downtime. And that is definitely something I want to say no to, right? Because that's a risk I don't want to assume. So I want to look at tools that start off natively passive. Can they utilize the passive, and do I get the data out of their passive techniques that I want? Then I want to look at how do I apply that into my environment? So if I start to say, hey, I've got a very specific vendor that I only utilize, does that tool support that vendor? And then I start applying it across the board. And as you build out your BOM, really what you want to focus on is looking at my 5 function categories, and do I have good coverage and support in any of those 5 function categories? So those 5 categories for those who are questioning are identify. Can I identify critical assets? Can I identify data as it comes and goes? Can I identify potential threats? Protect. Can I protect those critical assets? Can I protect data as it comes and goes? Can I protect against those potential threats? Detect. Can I quickly detect an event as it occurs on my network? And because the quicker I can detect it, the quicker I can respond, the more I can minimize the impact. And then lastly, recover. If I have an event that requires me to recover and continue business, do I have the ability to recover quickly and not just recover my data? And I think that's where we a lot of times focus on OT a lot, is I've got great backups around data, but can I recover my processes? So my ladder logic, my programming logic, my configurations, because can I restore those? Because even if I get my data back, but I've wiped all my ladder logic back, really not going to do me a whole lot of good from a production standpoint. So when you start looking at those 5 function categories, look for the kind of the products that fit in each, and do I have strong coverage across the board in those? I'm happy to talk product at any time. If you want to reach out, we can talk different solutions in that, but I really want to think more from a holistic approach to what are the things I'm trying to solve, and does that application fit based on the environment that I'm in?
All right. That is all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Scott Christensen, Todd Virden, and our sponsor, GrayMatter, for today's presentation. And on behalf of Industry Week, we hope you have a productive remainder of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.